Dear students, I am Shishpal Chauhan. I welcome you in my online teaching classes, and today I have brought before you the summary of The Invisible Man. It's a fast track summary and it will be a time saver for you. So let's begin with the chapter 1. I shall just read on the summary and you will keep on understanding. Chapter 1 begins. The invisible man visits the village Iping and stays on rent in an inn named Coach and Horses. His arrival in the village is unusual event because he comes in February in winter season when visitors are least expected. He is strangely dressed. No part of his body is visible except the artificial nose of pink color. Mrs. Hall is the owner of the inn and she is a greedy type of woman. She does not inquire about his identity and the stranger offers her 2 gold coins at once. After that she gets busy in preparing his lunch, and we also read in this chapter that the stranger does not like to talk to anyone. He talks only when he requires something. Mrs. Hall becomes afraid of his strange appearance. Now, chapter 2. From the previous chapter, we have come to know that Mrs. Hall is a little bit afraid of meeting the visitor who has come to stay in her inn. Mrs. Hall takes Teddy Henry, a clock mechanic, along with her in the invisible man's room. She takes formal permission from him in order to repair a clock in the parlor room. The stranger gives permission, showing his annoyance, and instructs the mechanic to be quick in his work because he would like to enjoy tea after that. But the clock mechanic becomes doubtful of him and slows down his work. He also tries to engage the invisible man in conversation so that he may get some clues about his true identity. But the invisible man snubs him for his slow work. After that, the mechanic finishes his work quickly, packs his bag, and leaves the room in a bad taste. The invisible man also asks Mr. Hall about his luggage. She tells him that it will arrive not before the next day due to the road hazards. He explains to her as to why he needs his luggage as early as possible. He also tells her as to why he has selected the inn in countryside. He needed solitude where no one can disturb him. He further adds that due to an accident he has to remain in dim light as brightness hurts his eyes. Another thing we come to know in this chapter is that Teddy Henry tells Mr. Hall about the stranger who is staying in the inn of his wife. He sows the seeds of doubt about him in Mrs. Hall's mind. Then Mr. Hall instructs his wife to be careful when the stranger's luggage arrives. Mrs. Hall becomes annoyed at such interference in her work, but at night she has a nightmare and could not sleep properly. Now chapter 3 begins. 10,001 bottle. This is the title of this chapter. The arrival of the visitor's luggage. In this chapter, the luggage of the visitor, the invisible man's luggage arrives. The next day, the stranger's luggage arrived at the inn in a cart. It included several crates and boxes which contained bottles of chemicals, apparatus, and many more things. The invisible man tries to reach the cart out of curiosity, but the cartman, who is Peer Inside, the name of the cartman is Peer Inside, his dog attacks him and rips one of his trousers. He has to run up to his room in an undignified way. Mr. Hall finds it an opportune time to visit the stranger on the excuse of showing his sympathy to him due to the dog's attack. So he enters his room but receives a very rude treatment. He comes back feeling humiliated and joins the people who have assembled in front of the Coach and Horses. Another notable thing we find in this chapter is that the invisible man has no aesthetic sense. He keeps his surrounding dirty. When he opened the crates and boxes, he scattered straw here and there in the room without caring for the carpet and the floor. Some drops of chemical and broken pieces of glass were also scattered there on the floor. When Mrs. Hall showed her annoyance to him, he rebuked her for entering the room without permission and proper knocking. When Mrs. Hall complained about the mess he had created in her room, he told her to add the expenses of damage to the carpet and floor in the bill. Towards the end of the chapter, we come to know that Fearenside and Teddy Humphrey discuss about his skin's color, and both of them conclude that his skin is black at some places and it is pink at some other places. Now chapter 4 begins. The summary of the chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. Dear students, up to now you have made an impression about the stranger's odd personality. He was an eccentric type of person, a crazy type of person who remained busy for most of his time in doing experiments in his room, usually locked from inside. During this time, there were a number of quarrels with Mrs. Hall on the issue of breaking domestic discipline, but every time he settled the issue by paying her money as compensation. Mr. Hall keeps on advising Mrs. Hall to get rid of the stranger by evacuating him from the inn. She promises it till the arrival of summer season. We also notice several irregularities about the stranger's behavior. He remains busy in his experiments and does not even visit the church. Sometimes he remains busy while some other day he rises late and walks in his room feeling weary, speaking to himself for hours together. He smokes for some time and then sleeps in his armchair. His temperament is also uncertain. For once or twice the things are snapped, torn, crushed or broken because of his deep chronic irritable nature. He also keeps talking to himself in a very low voice. He avoids going out when it is broad daylight. He prefers going out muffled up after the sunset, not caring for the weather, hot or cold outside. He chooses the loneliest paths, overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and bandaged face seem unusual to the homecoming laborers. The children who happen to see him start dreaming of ghosts in their sleep. People have made up several stories about him. Now the stranger has become the talk of the town. At this time, a public practitioner, Mr. Cuss, becomes curious to talk to him. The bandages have excited his professional interest, and also 1001 bottles also aroused his interest in the stranger. But he has also very bad experience when he enters his room without prior appointment or permission and tries to interview him. Now chapter 5 begins. The burglary at the vicarage. One day the vicar, the priest, and his wife report about a burglary in their study room. It occurs early in the morning of Monday, the day which is fully meant for the club festivities and enjoyed by the people of Iping. After that, we come to know as to how the burglary takes place in Mr. Bunting's study. They try to catch the thief red-handed but cannot do so. The conclusions they draw are the following. Someone lit the candle in the room. This is first conclusion. The second conclusion is the drawer was opened and the money was stolen. Now Mr. and Mrs. Bunting go quickly to the doorway. There is a violent sneeze in the passage. Both of them rush out as they do so, the kitchen door is slammed. Mr. Bunting instructs his wife to bring the candle. They hear a sound of bolts As Mr. Bunting opens the kitchen door, he notices that the back door of the kitchen is just opening. Mr. Bunting is certain that nobody has gone out of the door, but the door stood open for some time. And then it is closed with a slam. The room was empty now. They close it from inside and at last go down into the cellar. No one is there also. They find no one in the whole house. They search for the invisible man everywhere, but they do not get him. Chapter 6 begins now, The Furniture That Went Mad. This is the title of the chapter. In this chapter, we find that Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, had woken up earlier than before. They go into the cellar to care for the beer that was under the process of preparation. Mrs. Hall sends her husband to bring a bottle of sarsaparilla. This is a kind of sweet liquid prepared from this plant. Sarsaparilla from their room. Mr. Hall went upstairs to get it. He found the door of the stranger's room opened, so he calls Mrs. Hall there to have a look inside the stranger's room. Both of them entered the room and they found that no one was there. Mrs. Hall came near the bed and bent forward and touched the pillow and the bed clothes to feel the warmth of them, but she felt it all cold. It meant the stranger must have left his bed before 1 hour or more. As she did all that, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, left to one side as a heap. It all happened as if a person had rolled up the bedclothes into a heap and then threw them to one side. After that, the strangers had hopped off, and after a whirling flight in the air it was hit straight at Mrs. Hall's face. Then some other things like sponge from wash stand, chair, coats, trousers, etc. were all flung aside carelessly, and chairs suddenly started moving towards Mrs. Hall. Both the husband and the wife went out of the room in panic. The door was slammed violently from behind, and it was locked from inside. After some time, everything became quiet and calm. Mrs. Hall was so much petrified at this unusual scene she had ever seen in her life that she was almost fainted. With a great difficulty, Millie and Mr. Hall were able to bring her downstairs. After that, Millie was sent to call Mr. Sandy Waggers, the blacksmith, who was told by Millie that Mrs. Hall's furniture was behaving in a most extraordinary way. Mr. Huxter also joined them. They could not reach a decision, so they decided to know the facts first. Mr. Wedgers said that he would like to go and ask for an explanation for all that he had done there. He wanted to enter the invisible man's room and demand an explanation from him. Mr. Hall took some time to give his approval to Mr. Wedgers, saying, Then Mr. Wedgers went upstairs and knocked at the door, opened it, and said, "Excuse me." Then came the tremendous voice, "Go to the devil." This was the tremendous voice from the room and ordering him to shut the door. Thus his brief interview was terminated. So this is the end of chapter 6, and we shall begin with chapter 7, and we shall take up some more chapters for you. And till then, have a nice day. Thank you.